Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jack Davison, EVP at 3Vision. Today's session is a quick dive into the market for US programming around the world with specific consideration for the time and the conditions we find ourselves in now following the COVID-19 pandemic. We're happy to take questions at the end. If you can submit those through the Q&A tool, that would be great. And you will all be emailed links to the presentation and an on-demand version of it tomorrow. If you're watching this on demand or thinking of something later, please feel free to reach out by all the usual channels. Email details are at the end of this deck. Just because there's a few first timers, and welcome to some familiar names on the webinar. By way of very brief introduction, as I said, my name is Jack Davison. I'm EVP at 3Vision. We are a content consultancy firm that works and supports businesses across the sector with content issues and content challenges, using very practical and very real life experience. We offer strategic support and research, but as well as that research work, we have teams supporting services throughout EMEA as they launch new services or evolve what they're doing with content. And we span all sectors, really, anyone whose business is impacted by content. On today's topic, one thing I should probably mention for those of you who don't know, really a brief word more than anything else on the source of some of the data points today. We've been operating Show Tracker, our syndicated research product, for 4 years now, and the data tracks the distribution of US and European shows in 14 global markets. And that provides us and our clients in a variety of different forms of insight into how markets are changing and what's happening with content, but also gives us an opportunity to dive in and trend and look across the years a bit, as we'll do today, at relatively high level. But onwards, more specifically to today's session, the US remains uniquely placed in the world of TV, despite undergoing massive change. It remains a dominant force in global TV, featuring in the schedules and the inventories of on-demand services across the world, both through their own services and through local operation. And historically, these roots stem from the very early stages of the TV industry. If you forgive me for being slightly historical, but we do like going back to trace things. But obviously TV started in the 40s, but was held back globally by the war. And it was the US who emerged faster out of the 40s than anybody else. The first commercial was in 41 in the US, cable started in 48, even color was started in the 50s. And the 50s was when TV started to take over homes in the States, starting the decade with 10% household penetration and ending it with 90. In the UK, we weren't too slow. We were at 60, 67, 70% by the end of the decade, probably staying lagging behind a little bit, but catching up relatively quickly. But the US was way ahead. And as US audiences grew and the number of domestic independent stations across what was and remains a geographically large market, their needs for content did as well. And the major US networks took hold, kind of got themselves in a very strong position, dominated the market with high volumes of content that they could syndicate domestically. And then coupled with this was the growth in international markets as new stations globally launched, in particular independent ones, not state-owned ones. And the global market for US programming appeared. Here in the UK, I guess it was ITV, which launched mid-50s, and the BBC did use US program relatively early, but not to the extent that the ITV channels jumped in and doing in the mid-50s. So the global market for US TV experts started as early as the mid-50s with CBS, NBC and ABC. As production costs rose, kind of the basic model was established, which shows, and this is kind of interesting, which I didn't so much expect kind of when I was kind of going back in history, but deficit financing even was around at this very early stage in the late 50s. And producers were looking to make up budget deficits with domestic and international secondary markets. In the late 50s, kind of Westerns dominated US TV, and I think 8 out of 10 of the top top shows were westerns. But in the 50s, even then, Dragnet, I Love Lucy, Wagon Train, they all found sales and a lot of popularity in the UK. I think Perry Mason won kind of most popular overseas show in Australia in '59. Bonanza was a big hit in multiple markets. And then we start seeing kind of different names. I'm going to start to date myself as I move into the 70s and the 80s, but we start seeing the names that we remember from our childhood, the likes of Hawaii Five-0, Kojak, all helped increase the presence of US programming overseas. There's plenty more to discuss in another forum about cultural impact of shows and what that's done. But suffice to say, the shows grew in significance and success. I like kind of Dallas in the 80s with its sort of 20 million audiences in the UK. It's great that even in those days, kind of we had the scandals with, like, I think in '85, the BBC refused to pay kind of the $60,000 an episode asking price for the next series, as it's been such a success. ITV stepped in, and as you would expect, there's a huge outcry, political involvement, regulator involvement, and ITV was forced to sell it back at a loss, and the BBC kept it to 91. But even in those days, these things were happening. But by the 90s, ER, Seinfeld, Friends, The Simpsons, the list goes on, all start to dominate sales and in some markets ratings. HBO started kind of high-end TV drama, having mainly been focused on movies and sports before then in the US. And they developed their reputation for their kind of high-end, high-quality programming. But moving on into the noughties, kind of more formats, which actually started in the 50s. But there was a huge market, and things were to get more complicated. But by this stage, the US TV market was booming. As this production and distribution grew, so did the need for forums and markets. That is, if some of you can still remember what they're like in our current climate, but it's not precise. But in '63, kind of, they say arguably is when the LA screening started, when the Canadians came to LA. '64, Latin American execs came. I think the Brits arrived in '67 with BBC and ITV. I think the Australians, but in history tells, were the next, and then the Japanese were fifth in 1972. They moved the screenings to May, and by '83 the screening served about 200 buyers, and by 2018 there were about 1,500 buyers from about 70 countries, and the whole market here was growing and growing over this time, and at the same time MIP and NAPI were born. NAPI emerged more out of challenges from government intervention in the US, with the program directors from all the local US stations getting together as a forum to discuss and resolve these problems they were facing. But encouraged by the many syndicated programming salesmen that used to allegedly travel the US with their suitcases, the program directors organized what was to be the first NAPI, and now growing into a much bigger forum. And MIP, the same, arrived at about the same time in '63, first in Lyon, but very quickly moved to Cannes. And by 1985, they had MIPCOM. And again, if you believe the numbers that MIPCOM published, the numbers grew massively. And there is no doubt, it is a huge market, with a huge number of people coming. The figures for exports are notoriously difficult, because obviously each country uses different methodologies and different standards, but there is kind of no hiding from the fact that the US is the largest exporter by a long, long way. It's hard to compare and be precise with numbers, but even kind of using the numbers that are available, kind of the US market outstrips everybody by a long, long way, fluctuating around $16.5 billion a year, with the surplus being about 12 billion, which is a surplus is significantly higher than many US industries. Not so closely, but it is followed kind of next by the UK, which annually reports trade at, the last report was over $1 billion for the 18-19 financial year. And after that, it becomes a little less clear, with different bodies and different ministries stating levels with little clarity. But France and Australia have always been up in the top 5 or so markets. And also, so is the Netherlands, who aren't listed here because the figures are very hard to come by and to break out. As this, I think they're the 6th largest EU economy, they do fight above their weight in TV exports, especially with formats and the history they have there. and they're estimated to be often around the 3 or 4 level in terms of exports. But others continue to grow and rise, and Turkey and Israel, obviously for a variety of reasons, have climbed up fast in the rankings. But in terms of the context of where we are today, we've seen huge change, obviously, over the last 10 years in particular, in the way we kind of live, work, and consume all forms of content. And the US content distribution business has seen huge change in those 10 years. The internet has overtaken traditional TV and advertising terms on a global basis. And aside from 2010 in this chart, they've consistently outstripped TV in terms of growth in this decade. And looking at COVID-19 impacts, all signs that it's going to hurt TV deeper and longer than certainly than internet ad spend. And just looking at on the right, just looking at Netflix alone compared to pay TV growth, total pay TV growth over the last 10 years. It's a blunt kind of data point, but Netflix in terms of gross subscriber ads has been outstripping global pay TV subscriber growth in more recent years. But more generally and qualitatively in global markets, we all know that US TV has had some challenges over the last 10 years as local markets have prioritized their own productions and to some extent different genres of shows. Pricing has been under pressure, content has been pushed into less or worse time slots on free TV and marginalized by free TV, but the market still remains and more services are launching. Within the last 10 years, we've seen strategic change and things going one way only to change and come back the other. SVOD has changed the market in many ways, and probably most significantly, increasing the value and attention given to the usage of rights and reshaping, as a result of that, reshaping the kind of the ultimate financing of shows, as there now are new producers, new production partners, new financiers and new distributors. Netflix emerged in the US as a secondary market earlier than previous syndication options and provided regional, global options, moved from second window buyers to first, but then with originals, the sales opportunities slacked off for them. Not a boom and bust cycle for licenses, but significant change. And just kind of very superficially, kind of there's no end of change in the last 10 years in many different ways. Perhaps as a fitting entrance to the decade, Blockbuster went bankrupt, and arguably technical advancements perhaps not so significant, or the foundations were already laid, but kind of in depth and quality they continue to grow, but the foundations were very much laid before this decade. But the iPad launch, as did UHD, even VHS was still around, with the last one being made in 2016. But there were lots of varied and key themes. Pay TV launched TV everywhere across the globe at the start of the decade, but we're now increasingly breaking up the walled garden and going OTT by the end of it. Local SVOD launches, virtual pay TV, kind of new generation of super aggregators like Roku, Apple, and Amazon. Free TV increasingly focused on diversifying revenues away from traditional advertising, lots of new catch-up initiatives, targeted advertising, can't forget AVOD, new producers, whether it's Sky, Viaplay, Movistar in the pay TV terms, or Apple, or social media through Facebook and Snapchat. New cooperations, lots of frenemies getting together, SVOD appearing on pay TV, but also broadcasters joining up, media consolidation at the end of the decade, and changing business models for many. It's hard to underplay the influence of Netflix. They killed off Blockbuster at the start and then started their international rollout at the start of the decade. They began producing, won Emmy nominations by 2013, integrated in pay TV box the same year. They've now been moving into different types of programming, whilst Amazon also been playing a role in the sports market with entrance into key national pastimes with the NFL in the US, Premier League in the UK. The list goes on, as does kind of the new consumer needs that have grown in importance. But all of this adding complication, all of this fragmentation, diversification, and just change in the world of content. We've seen huge growth in production volumes as competition has grown. This chart on the left is much overused by many, but it's the number of scripted original series that are produced in the US year on year, but it does show huge growth, volumes growing massively since 2010. And with that and behind that is the budgets that have also grown and the overall spend that's grown. Netflix get the headlines with their productions growing, most notably, I guess, with their foreign language productions more recently. But they're not alone. Other international activity has also been extensive. Pay TV and SVOD operators investing, especially in drama, increasing spend, increasing output, sometimes with US partners. Free TV changes, a bit more nuanced, local, increasingly important across all genres, but scripted drama spend also up. The UK in particular, obviously a lot of that's in partnership with US players, but those shows qualifying for high-end tax relief, which basically means they're at least over £1.5 million an hour. They've grown almost 300% in the last 6 years. And back in 2017, Sky, just for one example here, kind of they underwrote the production of Britannia with a £37 million budget, which equaled just over £4 million an hour, which after tax credits equates to about 3.4. Although not the first, this was relatively unheard of levels for a European pay TV operator to get involved. But for them, the rationale was clear: security of supply, better rights, growing demand globally for high quality shows, and participation in the back end. Early projections of their own had that £3.4 million an hour budget reduced to a 1.4 million cost per hour to Sky, as they brought on Amazon in the US, and SkyVision secured other international sales. But services keep premiering US shows. Here, this just shows the cumulative growth of TV season premieres over the last 3 seasons across these European markets. And you can just see the straightforward kind of cumulative growth of the premieres. Things have changed over the years. That we'll know and hear that there's fewer output deals, fewer life of series, less volume on free TV, but they're still there. More recently, the change is more in the structural sense. This chart just shows how things have evolved over the last 3 complete TV seasons, and who has been premiering these shows. Pay TV remains critical, as it has done for some time, but here we can see increasingly the importance of SVOD services, in particular the local ones, as the Netflix and Amazon drop off with their priorities more on originals. But all markets have their own dynamics for US content, all can be with a huge amount of variation. Looking across the individual markets at premieres over the last 3 TV seasons, this is the aggregate view. You can see the variation by market, and you can start to see how a lot of anyone who's out there saying, and appreciate this anecdotally, but you can start seeing how the likes of Mexico and Poland remain almost exclusively a pay TV environment, with VOD a growing part of that. Sweden has become a market where premieres are increasingly on demand, whilst others remain a bit more of a mixed economy for programming. But behind these figures, there's also the direction of change. And just here, what we've done is just pull out for these markets, just the local SVOD operators and the global. By global, I mean Netflix and Amazon. And you can see in these markets universal growth in terms of share of premieres of local SVOD. With a market like Germany up to 29% for the 2019-20 new season shows. Meanwhile, Netflix and Amazon have dropped off everywhere in share last season. However, as with all of these data points, you need to dig further to uncover more the realities and what this shows, because the growth of premieres on local SVOD doesn't tell the whole story. If you take, for example, the German market, it's a busy slide here, but you can take a look at the document afterwards. But the numbers can disguise what's going on in the markets, with Germany probably a really good example. Here we can see how local SVOD is playing an important role. The chart on the left shows the last 4 TV seasons in a row. And you can see clearly how kind of SVOD local is growing in significance. But actually, when you actually look at who those SVOD local players are, they're the same buyers. They're the free TV buyers. It's the Join Plus and the TV Now Premium services that ProSieben and RTL respectively have launched. And it's very much the local free TV group driving their own innovations and their own SVOD tier, and shifting their US acquisitions to digital first rather than free TV. And local and traditional players fighting back have all contributes to the changing market for programming. We've many of you who've been with us before on webinars or sessions have seen sort of versions of this chart, and we don't use it just to sort of play with data. I mean, it has a lot of implications. The windowing is increasingly hard to balance nowadays as broadcasters offer much more accessibility and usability around what they do. Enhancing catch-up, which is what this shows year on year, how catch-up has become more and more enhanced, and now from pay TV terms, 68% of premieres come with in-season stacking and 12% come as a box set. And even in the most recent years, free TV operators have been employing much more enhanced catch-up in this way. There are some markets, I should say, where there is a reluctance to innovate, and it does pull down the numbers, in fact, but trends still show the growth. And it is important because at its core, one of the fundamentals, it is one of the fundamentals to the complexity of the ultimate revenue profile of a TV show, contributing to the second window sales challenge. The last 2 or 3 years have seen almost a new category of sale come to market, which we know a lot of people talk about and we see, which is the post SVOD second window deal. We've seen swings throughout the decade in terms of what SVOD do, and even now we feel there's an equilibrium of some sort hasn't been reached. There's many different views as to value, and in some cases outright exceptions in certain markets, with many different considerations, but there are broadcasts out there that are experimenting more and are looking more and are using shows after Netflix and Amazon. And this just shows 7 shows that have got second windows in 3 or more markets on a broadcaster. ITV published some stories more recently about Bodyguard and the success they've had there, and actually it has done very well in getting onto free TV, perhaps as a result of its incredible free TV success on the BBC in the UK. But for some of these broadcasters, I mean, this is just a subset of 7 shows, but for some of the broadcasts and some of the titles that are here, it's not simply an experiment for one season. Some of the broadcasts in France, Canal Plus, for example, and Canada, Super Channel have been airing the second season of shows, and Mediaset has aired all 3 seasons of some shows like Shooter, and others are working it out. But it comes with its challenges, and it's hugely varied. And as more shows come out of SVOD holdback, we'll see how this evolves. And if you just look at the aggregate picture in selected markets, you can see some of that variation. And here we've highlighted one of the other key issues, which is the utilisation of that content. Germany here leads with the most second windows after global SVOD, with RTL channels themselves just taking 5 titles. Typically broadcasters following SVOD are unable to get any kind of stacking rights, any kind of enhanced catch up, and it's very limited to ensure they can't, as they're not competing or crossing over with the Netflix and Amazon services, by allowing people to binge on a full season through catch up. But despite all this, there are broadcasters working around these issues, and some are actually being quite unorthodox in the way they do that, airing multiple episodes a week or sometimes in a day in order to take advantage of 30-day catch-up and put an entire season on its catch-up service, if only for a short amount of time. We've seen Canal Plus do this in France, Tele5 in Germany, even 5 Star in the UK. And this rapid change of broadcasters' proposition is also kind of key to the distribution environment. As we've showed earlier, enhanced catch-up and box sets are on the up with broadcasters, and this includes what is increasingly termed now BVOD, which is basically AVOD by broadcasters. BVOD is seeing very strong revenue growth, albeit from a low level, and it's strengthened itself by the dynamics of the ad sale market and also by their existing position in the market with the ads being sold alongside a TV sale. And while AVOD is at the top of the hype curve, I think it's fair to say, maybe slipped slightly as an unfortunate consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has seen very strong revenue growth in the US, It was a sector that many were nervous about for years. It's now delivering revenues, finding a better place in the rights ecosystem, and people are more willing to license better content to them. As it spreads globally, though, it remains to be seen how the what I would call pure play AVOD players, the Rokus, the Plutos, the Tubies of the world will address it, and how the balance between the different types of AVOD works out. It's with BVOD where we see premieres and second window kind of for scripted TV grow and appear, and AVOD pure play operators are sticking to what they do best and to what their model can really afford with archive and library right now. But as the two rights of free TV and AVOD butt up against each other, this will be an interesting area to watch. But we would say it's likely that it'll be a while before there'll be competition for new season content on these pure play AVOD services. Strategically, however, the end of the decade probably saw its biggest shift in the market with the major D2C launches. D2C isn't new. Studios have launched numerous pay TV channels internationally from as early as the 80s as pay TV began to roll out in Europe and other markets. But as D2C efforts have grown in size and significance, its influence on the market for global programming is greater. Clearly, each studio's activity varies. Some resisting any new, particularly new D2C efforts, some with more plans to come, and others launched, but some of those with the implications for international not entirely clear. This chart shows the proportion of sales by studios to their own services. You'd be mistaken to think that the D2C initiatives have immediately meant that studios have shut up shop in terms of selling content to third parties. Although there is a shift in the market, the data isn't fully feeding through to the data yet. Only with Lionsgate here, who operate Stars Play, you see an almost complete withdrawal from third-party sales, with the content pipeline going straight through to Stars Play. MGM obviously have no significant service on their own internationally. Sony themselves are limited again. They have their pay TV groups, but that's relatively limited. And with the others, either through existing output deals, new deals where third-party values are too high to ignore, like HBO deals, or potentially timing with their own service rollouts, there's still a mixed market for sales. The data is showing small signs of Warner Media and Disney increasingly internalizing sales, but it is early. But if you look at it the other way around, you can also see the importance of studio-operated services in the international market already. And it's very clear from the data here, this is just for 2019 new season shows, and these are the top European buyers of shows, and the studios are there at the top. And for many years they've been very significant as they've been operating their own channel groups. While local service owners are acquiring content, cross-territory channel groups owned by the studios play such a significant role. For some of these groups, a large proportion of their acquisitions come from their own distributors engaging in vertical integration. And you can see here how Warner and NBC, which now does include the Sky channels, dominate in terms of buying. Warner Media services include the former Turner channels and prolific HBO local SVOD services in Spain and Sweden, but over half their content on these platforms is coming from Warner Brothers distribution. But then, of course, the other side of that is half of it is coming from elsewhere. NBC Universal sits in second place after Warner, with some of their big brands like Sci-Fi often going to third parties for content that fits within its genres. And Sky, its channels themselves take a large amount of third-party content with Warner's HBO deal across their markets. But local channel groups in France and the UK feature with the Canal Plus and more other local buyers there. But if you remove the buyers from Self, the rank changes significantly. Warner Media falls into second place behind NBC Universal, and more local buyers surface from Italy, Mediaset, from Sweden, Nent, Telefonica in Spain, and major US studios such as Disney fall out of the top 10. Moving on, and just before we wrap up, it's worth taking a quick look ahead as to what some of the production delays may mean. Although production is resumed in some way, with much of it coming to a halt in response to the pandemic. International services relying on US acquisitions are likely to suffer a deficit in their planned programming this autumn season, along with their own domestic production issues. What this chart does is, very simply, it looks at the average number of premieres of full US season shows in the same season internationally, i.e. New content straight from the US in these markets, and could be seen to imply where shortages of supply may impact more. The left-hand side chart suggests that broadcasters in Australia and Spain will have the largest deficit of content and may look to fill some of those gaps with either library content or previously unsold titles in their respective regions, with Spain on average premiering 8 new season shows and 12 returning shows in what is effectively Q4 of the year. Other broadcast channels in markets such as Sweden have lower levels of acquisitions for US shows in this period, as it's the VOD services such as HBO Nordic and Viaplay that take a larger proportion of shows. And the right-hand side chart shows VOD services, SVOD services, and it shows how the Swedish SVOD services are likely to suffer the highest content deficit across these markets. Spain, with its own localized HBO service, also comes in high, and it suggests a wide range of services may need to reapproach distributors for older content. Global SVODs such as Netflix and Amazon, which are included in this data, have generally seen lower levels of US full season acquisitions year on year anyway. So notwithstanding their own production issues, they were already expected to acquire less content for the full season. But it seems inevitable, whichever way you look at it, that all services will be looking to fill holes. Free TV will find it hard to rely on their own library and new productions and may need to look a bit more smartly at unsold US shows, with their position probably the most fragile coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic ad market collapse. Pay TV is in an equally unprecedented position, usually riding out recessions well as people stop spend on more expensive items. But they now face challenges from lack of sports, even though summer's restarted, and a new competitive environment. In other words, consumers have more SVOD alternatives. SVOD may be able to disguise its issues better, but Q4 2020 for many operators is likely to be a big anti-churn period. Finally, it's worth remembering there are huge volumes of content being produced and a great deal remains unsold. In absolute terms, there are significant numbers of US shows that remain available in the market. Almost 70% of the current season, that's the 2019-20 season, remained unsold in April, in average across markets, dropping to 24% when you go back to the 17-18 new season shows. Italy leads in simple volume terms. Since 2016, there's 197 shows unsold, albeit many of those have been cancelled or just maybe just 1 or 2 seasons. But all markets have numbers. Germany's up almost, and France are almost at 150. Some unsold shows have multiple seasons unsold, and maybe more of a target for services wanting to meet the demands of binge set culture, with across just the big 5 Euro markets, over 24 US shows with over 3 seasons committed, and with the list bigger for shows with more than just 1 season. It does skew to comedy and obviously non-cancelled shows, but the data does also just about prove the old adage that comedy doesn't travel well. Globally, on average, 54% of comedy remains unsold versus 34%, but you can see the variety by market there and see some obvious points around the English-speaking markets, but you can see maybe where there are bigger challenges. And it raises the question of how much pragmatism may come from broadcasters that may become willing to compromise on maybe, well, for want of a better term, their creative visions or demands to fill schedules. Thanks for your time. If this session has raised any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. The US led the way with content exports from the earliest point in history, which we find is always good to look back at. But it's lived through lots of periods of change. But right now, we feel it's unparalleled in terms of kind of the strategic change that's going on. And this is irrespective of the COVID-19 pandemic, which itself is causing issues. there's a great deal of influences, and they all vary by market, that need to be balanced, with more services competing, more vertical integration, and the shifts by studios that selectively impact markets in different ways. The full season will be critical for broadcasters struggling from the impacts of the pandemic, but how they will use USOs remains to be seen, and SVOD will be challenged too. But perhaps you have to feel they're better insulated from the impact than the broadcasters. And there is kind of, it's hard to doubt that coming out of COVID-19, we're going to see a significant acceleration of change, and how that affects the free TV businesses and the way they buy and their propositions will be key to follow. That's it. We have a few. I'll look now just to the Q&A. We've got a few questions. Are these new local SVOD services enough to save traditional broadcasters like ProSieben and RTL? Well, fitting given what I just said. There's no choice for free TV but to rapidly innovate and diversify their revenues away from traditional broadcasting. But how well they can do this will vary hugely by market. I think the model is key. I think a lot of them will be very challenged. I think it will be naive to think that local operators can grab spend from people's wallets in some markets where kind of the expectation is that there isn't a spend associated at the point of access to get hold of the content. But it will vary by market, but it is a challenge. It is a question to ask. Will the D2C services affect ability of other services to acquire content? And undoubtedly to a degree. I guess the question is how much. It's clear from Warner Media that they're still doing big ticket HBO deals in markets with Sky and otherwise. And I think it's clear from some other operations that they are prioritizing their direct consumer services. But there seems to us to be far, trying to think of the best words, there's plenty of exceptions to the rules, and it will lead to content being withheld, but we feel there's enough out there that it will probably be, well, it's hard to quantify, but it will be on a limited but impactful level. Let me have a look. I think that's it for questions. Thank you all very much for your time. Again, as we say, if you have any questions, please feel free to get back to us. And it's good to talk to you all. Take care. Bye.